NetCredit is here to say yes, because you're more than a credit score. Apply in minutes and get a decision as soon as the same day. Loans offered by NetCredit or lending partner banks and serviced by NetCredit. Application subject to review and approval. Learn more at netcredit.com/partners. NetCredit. Credit to the people.
Tired of listening to the same old playlists or podcasts over and over? Maybe it's time to mix things up. Try something new. Hit Explore. Avoid the blah and the boring before you even put your headphones in. Add some fun in the mix. Say yabba dabba doo to a bowl of Pebble cereal and enjoy by the spoonful. Fruity and Cocoa Pebble cereal. Less blah, more yabba dabba doo. Head to your nearest grocery store to buy Pebble cereal today. The Flintstones and all related characters and elements copyright and trademark Hanna-Barbera.
Last year, Americans ate 32 billion chicken wings. Who knows just how many helpless sides of celery were heartlessly thrown away? But this year, celery neglect can stop with you and irresistible Jif peanut butter. Because you can make a snack to make a difference. You can buy a jar of Jif to save the celery. So please, don't let celery be decoration for wings. Tap the banner to save the celery.
Canonically in the Aeneid, that is not how he dies. Ergo, Percy agrees. The Aeneid is not canon.
There is, unfortunately, I think it's because it's in alphabetical order, but at the back of the book, there's like a recommended reading section, and the Aeneid is first.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Monster Donut, a literary and historical deep dive into the Percy Jackson series and all of its following spin-offs. I'm Emily, a classic scholar-ish.
And I'm Phoebe, a dramaturg and story consultant. And today we will be deep diving into Percy Jackson's Greek gods.
Aren't they just myths, you might ask? How are they going to analyze these? Is Emily just going to yap this whole episode?
Yes.
Yes. But also... I mean, is that any different from a normal Monster Donut episode? No, but actually there is a shocking amount of Percy hot takes that we need to talk about. Phoebe said when we were talking about this earlier this week, you were like, this is like getting a glimpse into Percy's brain in a way. Like what did you say exactly?
Yeah. So this book came out in August 2014.
Which you can tell by the fact that at one point Ares refers to people as his peeps, and he can't even at one point.
There's so much dated language in this book, it was driving me crazy. But it came out in August 2014, which was between House of Hades and Blood of Olympus. So for a long time, this was the actual last time that we were inside Percy's head.
That's
so
funny.
if you were reading this as the books were coming out, this was kind of a post House of Hades perspective on the gods that we were getting from Percy. I think technically it probably is written after Blood of Olympus, if we're thinking, like, logically.
I mean, he has to go back to New York at some point to canonically meet with the publisher. So...
Right. And at the end he says, peace from Manhattan. So, like, it takes place after Blood of Olympus, but to the reader, it is before Blood of Olympus.
And then Percy Jackson's Heroes, I'm assuming, came out a few years later, after Blood of Olympus.
I think it was the next year, 2015. But yeah, in case you are unfamiliar with what this book is, it kind of quickly runs through the Titans and Giants and all of that, and then goes god by god with the Olympians, and tells, like, 3 to 4 major stories about each of them.
With some very interesting picks, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
So before we get into them, content warning for sexual assault throughout this episode. It's involved in basically all of the stories that Percy talks about in this book. And also, we will probably be discussing a attempted suicide later on. But before we get into all of that,
some of the opening lines of this book are, a publisher in New York asked me to write down what I know about the Greek gods, and I was like, can we do this anonymously? Because I don't need the Olympians mad at me again. But if it helps you to know your Greek gods and survive an encounter with them, if they ever show up in your face, then I guess writing all this down will be my good deed for the week. If you don't know me, my name is Percy Jackson. Yeah, I have so many questions. There's so much to unpack here. First of all, Percy Jackson is a published author in the Riordan verse, like, officially. I'm like, was it his mom's publisher? Was he introduced by camp scribe Rick Riordan to the publisher? Like, who came to him with this question?
That's a good, because that's the thing. It's like, how do they know to reach out to this kid?
Mm-hmm. I think it must be like the in-universe Rick Riordan hooked him up somehow.
It must be. Or like maybe Apollo hooked him up. Maybe a publisher reached out to like Apollo in disguise and was like, do you know anybody who could write like a good story on the Greek gods? And Apollo was like, let me do my friend Percy Jackson a solid and get him some royalty and go.
So I feel like that would make sense post Trials of Apollo. If we say this is written post Trials of Apollo, because we know Trials of Apollo is also written by Apollo. So if Apollo's already got a publisher he's working with.
Right. Yeah, Apollo's hooked him up. This makes sense, though, because, okay, let's think about the timeline here, right? Like, Wrath of the Triple Goddess takes place after Heroes of Olympus, at which point, canonically, Percy's like, ugh, a book about me? Gross. It's gotta be Apollo. Apollo had, like, because here's the thing, right? Reading the Apollo chapter, I'm like, this has to have been after Trials of Apollo. Like, there's no way Percy would think this about Apollo before Trials of Apollo. Apollo wrote Trials of Apollo, pulled a Cicero, wrote an epic about himself.
Mm-hmm. I was literally reading the Apollo chapter. I was like, did Apollo write this one?
I know. He was like, hey, Percy, I've got a great chapter about myself I want you to publish. But they said they wanted a whole book to go with it, and a short chapter, I'm putting in quotations, and in quotes, say, a short chapter about just Apollo won't sell for some reason. Mortals are wild. That's so insulting. I vaporized a couple of them, but then I thought about it some more, and they're totally right. So here, write the rest of this book. Can you be my ghostwriter?
Okay, in that case, I would say mid-Trials of Apollo. Other important things to note about that opening sentence. The opening lines of it remind me of The Lightning Thief, but this time he's trying to protect you from the gods instead of the monsters.
Yeah.
Like, it's the opening of The Lightning Thief, but instead of warning you about the monsters sensing you and coming for you, he's warning you about the gods, which is a fun switch up.
I do enjoy that.
Yeah.
I enjoy it a lot.
End of series, Percy Jackson coming back with the same opening, but this time he's telling you who to really watch out for. It makes sense, considering the conclusions we came to in our Heroes of Olympus readings.
Okay, knowing this was written, like, after House of Hades, okay, this helps. I have some stuff to say on that later. But,
Percy says, my story has already been written down in some books that are total fiction, wink wink, and I am just a character from the story, cough, yeah right, cough.
Okay, so, wait, so he has written them?
Either he's written them or someone else. He just says they are already written down.
I think we have our answer, Phoebe. We know what Percy majored in school.
Creative writing.
Creative writing. He is just like you. The swimmer to creative writing pipeline. It's strong.
Mm-hmm. But genuinely writing, canonically Percy writing in this massive edition of the book that I'm reading from, a 300-something page book, but in any normal version of it is even longer. Like, Percy canonically writing a book that's that long is really impressive.
Yeah, and I really enjoy it. Even though I feel like, I should say as a disclaimer, I'm very familiar with some of the versions of some of these myths from the original sources, and less familiar with others. But the ones I am quite familiar on, I did notice were basically, like, almost word for word the source material, but as written by Percy through the lens of Percy.
Mm-hmm.
So, which leads me to believe that
Percy's plagiarizing is what you're saying.
A little. Not plagiarizing, because they're all in the public domain, and they're not even written in English. I guess he would have been reading... Well, no, he's reading the original source of the ancient Greek. You know what, Phoebe? Percy's translating. This is a translation exercise.
Yes.
Emily Wilson who? He's doing Hesiod. He's doing...
I think that makes
Homeric
sense.
Hymns.
Because, I mean, it's not like he doesn't read ancient Greek. Like...
No. And Latin in some cases.
Yeah. This is his translation. I love that.
Yeah, he's translating it.
He does note, just go easy on me while I'm telling you about the gods, alright? There's like 40 bajillion different versions of the myth, so don't be all, well, I heard it a different way, so you're wrong. I'm going to tell you the versions that make the most sense to me.
Yeah. So let's dive in.
All right.
With the creation myth.
Yes. Chapter 1, the beginning and stuff.
This one, I could be wrong, but I believe it is pulled from Hesiod's Theogony. Hesiod, for those who don't know, is one of the most ancient Greek sources. So Hesiod and Homer are kind of written in the same style of Greek, and they're kind of date to approximately the same period, and they're both sort of this epic poetry style. And the Theogony is Hesiod's sort of mythology text. That's where a lot of people get a lot of their sources. My tip-off on Hesiod is... Well, it's interesting because I think we also get a bit of Apollodorus in there. Apollodorus is sort of the other main ancient Greek text source on myths. Apollodorus is where you also get a lot more variation. Like Apollodorus will sort of report on a lot of different versions of myths and be like, oh, and then in this town they tell it this way, and then in this town they tell it this way. But Eros to me is my tip-off because Eros or Cupid has kind of two origin stories. One of which is that he's the son of Aphrodite. The other is that he's this primordial god and the twin to death. If you hear the first version, it's probably Apollodorus or a Roman source. If you hear the second version, it's Hesiod. And so the fact that we have both kind of tips me off that Hesiod is involved in this. Yeah, so I say I believe a lot of this is pulled from Hesiod. And Hesiod's Theogony starts with chaos and tells this story of Gaia and Uranos. I say Uranos because, as Percy correctly points out, there's no other way to say his name without it sounding silly.
His physical description of Uranos is funny to me. Uh-huh. Because there's no reason for it. In canon. He's never met
hair
him.
Colors.
He describes him as a tall, buff guy with longish, dark hair. He wore only a loincloth and his skin changed color, sometimes blue with cloudy patterns across his muscles, sometimes dark with glimmering stars. And then he says, hey, Gaia dreamed him up like that, don't blame me. And I was like, you made that up.
I thought the kind of characterization of Uranos was interesting. The characterization of Kronos in this is fascinating. Yeah. But the characterization of Uranos is interesting. Because Percy, you can tell he's trying to tell this story in a way that I think he thinks will be the most relatable and the most understandable from the perspective of a mortal. But it also strikes to me as very similar to his relationship with Gabe, where he describes Uranos as basically this awful bad dad, bad husband who's just kind of the worst. Which I don't think is an accurate reading of the mythology, but the way Percy kind of describes him, it feels very Gabe to me. There's a lot of emphasis on how he mistreats Gaia and their children.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about the Gabe connection, but it makes sense that would be what Percy reads into their relationship.
So we get the story. We all know this one. Titans are born, then the Cyclops, the 100-handed ones. Gaia and Uranos have a falling out. They don't like the quote-unquote imperfect children, lock them all up, and Gaia, in this version, Gaia's the one who creates a scythe.
Yeah.
And basically tries one by one to goad her children into using it against their father, which is interesting. Because I feel there's a lot of emphasis placed on her one by one going to each of them. I'd have to double check. It's been a minute since I've read Hesiod or Apollodorus, but I think this is a liberty. It might be a sentence where she went to them one by one, but Percy really goes one by one down the line and kind of comes up with different reactions they have and different ways they try to get out of it. And then we get Kronos, where again another, I think, liberty is taken in the mythology, where Percy characterizes Kronos in a fascinating way. Because I'm reading this you're talking about Luke, Percy. And I knew that going in. In my head, I was oh, we're going to talk about Kronos. I bet this is actually about Luke. And oh boy, is it ever. The thing about Hesiod is he's not descriptive like this. He doesn't... The ancient Greek writers were not particularly invested in characterizing the gods or giving them personalities necessarily. So... It seems that Percy's reading a lot into this situation in a way that is very interesting.
The two descriptions that I marked in Kronos' introduction, Kronos volunteers. It says, The youngest of the 12 shouldered his way forward. Kronos was smaller than his brothers and sisters. He wasn't the smartest or the strongest or the fastest, but he was the most power-hungry. I suppose when you're the youngest of 12 kids, you're always looking for ways to stand out and get noticed. But later on the page, he's talking about the reasons why he might take up the scythe, and it says, as for killing his dad, why not? Uranus barely noticed him, neither did Gaia for that matter. His parents probably didn't even know his name. Kronos hated being ignored. He was tired of being the smallest and wearing all those stupid Titan hand-me-downs.
I can tell you, none of that's in Hesiod.
Yeah. The take on Kronos of him being like a neglected and forgotten kid who is trying to get his parents' attention.
It's interesting, too, like, throughout, like, even as Kronos kind of takes up the scythe and does more with it, like, Gaia's still like, who are you? Which I think is played off for comedy, but to me, like, that's a take on this myth I've never seen another writer do, which is, like, what are Kronos' motivations exactly beyond power? Because I think in most versions of the myth that I'm familiar with, it's sort of Gaia kind of goes to her children, but none of them are, they're all too scared to rise up against their father, except for the youngest Kronos.
Yeah.
And I wrote down something as well where there's a line where it's like he takes it up also because he alone understands the power of the sickle, of like what Gaia is asking and like what he's about to do. Like he alone among his siblings is sort of like the one that understands the potential for revolution.
There's definitely something also in the inclusion of Gaia being the one to create the first scythe.
I think that is in some of the myths.
Yeah, there's something about Gaia creating the scythe, giving it to her son so that he can kill his father, and then that weapon being used by Luke in an attempt to kill his father, and it being like forged again in the earth in a volcano later in the series, and something about passing weapons on in this series, because you've also got it with the cursed blade, you've got it with Riptide, like, I don't know, this adds a mythology to the scythe reading this book that, you know, I feel like we don't really think about much in the original series.
Yeah, there's something about it, about also kind of holding it over all the kids and them all not wanting to take it up, like actively resisting it. There's also a lot of detail of how Kronos kind of tricks his father into getting cut into pieces. That again, it like creates a character that has a lot more depth and is a lot more interesting and is a lot more like of a trickster than you generally see in the mythology. Like, it's all there, but I think it's brought out in a way that really emphasizes the trickster elements, which make me think of Luke, but also make me think of Percy. Although I want to talk about that more specifically when we get to Zeus. Then there's an interesting thing, too, where Kronos' dispatching of Uranos kind of creates the curse that his children will always overpower him, and like creates this prophecy and creates this fate. So as we transition also into the next section, I think it also adds this weight to the act, but also the scythe of like power transfers. So we move on to the Golden Age, which is the rule of Kronos.
Yes, the Golden Age of cannibalism is what he calls it.
You know what's so funny is I read that title and I was like, what cannibalism?
I know. I had the same reaction. I was like, I don't remember that in any of my...
Yeah, because I'm thinking about like Golden Age, like again, Hesiod of like, oh, and again, this is a part of why I'm like, oh yeah, we're going with Hesiod here, because we're like sort of casting the ages of men and all of this stuff. And
yeah, but there's not a whole lot of focus on what's going on with the humans in this section, so...
Yeah, but we do get a lot of information on the Titans and our friend Phoebe.
Yeah, Phoebe mentioned everybody.
not the hunter of Artemis Phoebe, but Phoebe the goddess. And our friend Mnemosyne is the inventor of writing, which I wrote down because I was like, no, you don't have writing yet, ancient Greece. Give it a couple thousand more years here. And also, you stole your writing system from the Minoans twice.
See, I read that line and was like, oh, Percy just made the same Nemo sign joke. Has he met our self-insert? Or am I so much like Percy that I came up with the same joke in my Choose Your Own Adventure? I just think that this might be confirmation that he has met either Zane Carver or us in the Percy Jackson
He's
universe.
met Y/N. He's met Y/N. Confirm.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so on to the Zeus stuff, though, because this also was really interesting to me. Number one, I felt like strong Sally vibes in his description of Rhea. Like, he's talking about her as, like, being the best mother ever, as, like, being this, like, beautiful woman who just, like, is doing her best. Like, I felt very much like he was pulling that inspiration.
He's very sympathetic toward her.
And as we get into the story of Zeus as well, there's certain liberties and interesting details that he kind of pulls from to, I think, again, make it more, like, relatable to his audience. But also, to me, it makes me feel like he's kind of putting himself into these stories a lot more. So he talks about, like, Zeus having to getting a summer job, and, like, how he was a good cupbearer for Kronos and, like, tricking him into things. And, like, the way he, like, describes Zeus's trickery in particular had me be like, oh, Zeus is Percy and Kronos. Like, he's finding his way in. And what's interesting, though, is the fact that he is finding his... Like, as a writer, I do find my way into stories by pulling for myself. But it's interesting to me that he is doing that with Zeus, specifically. I thought he put a lot of detail into Kronos, and I was mistaken. The detail he goes into with Zeus is so much more. And also, like, painting him in a very, like, heroic light, which I thought was interesting. Like, it makes him, I wrote down, like, it sounds like he could be any half-blood, just, like, on a mission, being like, all right, I gotta do this quest, I'm gonna do my best with it. I'm just trying to, like, I'm not trying to be the master of the universe. I'm trying to free my siblings. I'm trying to do what's right. I'm trying to free all these people from this tyrannical rule. So I think there's something interesting there about that characterization, and also in the cycles of this story, because that's the thing about the Greek creation myth, is there's a bunch of cycles of rules. Like, you know, they all start from a place of idealism and of ousting the prior bad, and then fall into the same trap. So yeah, it's interesting seeing Percy's perspective on this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like this story is almost where I see, I mean, it's going to be in every version of this story, but the Sally Gabe parallels simply based on the Medusa's head situation and the, like, child and mother plotting to figure out how do we get rid of this guy. There's rocks. Rocks are involved.
Yeah. Rocks are involved. People are stone or something. Stone baby? ?
But yeah, with him reading himself into Zeus, it feels like a way of him working through that situation. So this continues into the Olympians bash some heads is the next chapter, which is where we get the actual trick and overthrowing of Kronos and the war, the first Titan War. Something I thought was interesting, the way that the gods and their domains is written, it's very faded. It's like they're all built for the domains that they end up with by chance. Like, when they have their weapons made, they just sort of end up with weapons that control the domains that they will control in the future. And, like, they draw lots, so it should be up to chance, but they end up with the things that their weapons do. And the way that they're each described as soon as they're out of Kronos' stomach is very, like, they've just always been like that. It felt fated to me, but then we learn later in the book the fates came later. So it seems like nothing was technically fated here, and yet it is. So
yeah, it is an interesting question. I mean, there's sort of a bit of bias of, like, how are we going to characterize all these gods? Well, I'm going to characterize them the way I know them and the way I've met them.
yeah.
But I do feel like with the other gods, when I read Greek mythology, it feels a little random, like, what they all end up doing and, like, what their domains are in terms of, like, they just sort of pick something up and that just kind of becomes a thing they're a god of. Versus I feel like in this version, when you read it, there's a lot more emphasis put on, like, they became the god of this thing because they made it.
Yeah.
Like, they did this thing and it was powerful enough to make them, like, the god of it, essentially. Like, I'm thinking specifically about Dionysus. Like, he invents wine, and wine is such a great invention that he just becomes the god of wine. And, like, I think the way a lot of the other gods are characterized is kind of similar, where it's like they're born and then they make something, and then that's what makes them a god.
Which is why I thought it was... There's a contrast there with how the big three end up with what they are the god of. Because, like, they drew lots, but also the weapons that, like, the Cyclops happen to throw at them are the things that, like, control... Like, the lightning bolt controls lightning, and, like, the trident gives Poseidon his Earthshaker powers and everything.
But maybe you can switch them around and it makes sense. Like... The lightning bolt, for example, like Thor in Norse mythology comes from Norse mythology comes from the same source as Greek mythology. But Thor is like the god of lightning, but also the god of the forges. And there's like lightning storms on the sea. And like the Helm of Darkness I could see working for like, you know, if you characterize it differently, it's like flying around and like always spying on things like the wind. Or, like, you know, a trident, earth-shaking, I feel like, could be an underworld power. Like, you could make the argument the domains shaped the powers of the items. That being said, though, there is a line later, when the Fates are born, about how the Olympians are afraid of them because nobody knows if they can control immortals or not, which indicates to me that they probably can.
Oh, yeah. They can.
So there is something about the power of fate in this world that is clearly... higher than the gods. So I guess the question is then, does that power come before the Fates? Like, do they have to be born for it to be... I don't know.
That's what I'm wondering. Was anything fated before the Fates showed up?
So then we go one by one through the Olympians.
I love the way that Percy just skips right over Zeus. Like, the page literally just has Zeus with, like, it's struck through.
Oh... I love that, actually. That's really funny. That's not in the audiobook, because I don't know how they would record that.
Oh, yeah. What did they do in the audiobook?
They just didn't. There's no chapter about Zeus. I figured we'd already gotten our Zeus chapter on account of the fact that, like...
Oh, no, there must have been. They must have read the Zeus non-chapter. It probably just sounded like it was part of the last chapter because it's so short.
Yeah, Zeus. Oh, yeah. Zeus, 30 seconds.
Why is Zeus always first? Seriously, every book about the Greek gods has to start with this guy. Are we doing reverse alphabetical order? I know he's the king of Olympus and all, but trust me, this dude's ego does not need to get any bigger. You know what? Forget him. We're going to talk about the gods in the order they were born. Women first. Take a back seat, Zeus. We're starting with Hestia.
In the Last Olympian, Percy, I think Hestia does tell the story of her giving a Percy to Dionysus, although in this book, Percy asserts that it's not in the ancient sources, which is true. I also liked Percy's hot take that Hestia definitely helped Prometheus.
I know.
Feels right.
I was like, look at him theorizing on Greek mythology.
I agree with him. I think he's right.
Yeah, it makes sense.
I did think it was deeply funny that they included a story with Priapus, because Google him if you're over 18. To put it delicately, if you have an erection that lasts longer than 4 hours, it's called priapism for a reason, and it's named after this guy. So it's kind of wild that that story's in this book. But I think it's just because that's in Ovid, and it's like one of the only actual stories about Hestia in like any mythology.
He's the one who she meets in the woods or something, right? At a party?
Yeah, he like sees her like sleeping in the woods and is like...
Yes.
This is the first of many times in this story where I'm like, how are we going to write about this story that's very much about rape?
I kept thinking that, like, it's like Percy was attempting to tell these stories in the most family-friendly way possible, like in the softest way that he could do it, until like halfway through the book he just gives up and starts telling it to you straight.
Yeah, like he kind of... It starts off really trying, and then it kind of devolves.
At a certain point, he was just like, I'm just going to tell you. I think if you made it this far, I'm just going to tell you.
Yep.
There is a point in this chapter where this guy tries to flirt with Hestia, though, and, like, I hate the way Percy writes flirting so bad. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He's never done it for a day in his life. He doesn't sound cool. He just...
Isn't the word sweet cheeks used at some point?
Probably. There's a lot of...
And then we get Demeter, who does have a lot of stories and mythology around her. And again, So first we start with a story of Zeus. And again, Percy's using delicate language here. Like, what does he call it? He was just like, oh, they, never mind. They got together, but it wasn't good. It wasn't
in a bad way.
Yeah. It's like, okay, Percy. But he first talks about the conception of Persephone, who is the child of Zeus and Demeter. And then, very interesting, we talk about a story of Poseidon also doing that to Demeter and having 2 kids with her. Mm-hmm. Where she tries to run away and turns into a horse, but Poseidon, turns into a horse also and catches up with her. And kind of reminds me of Sleipnir, honestly. I wonder if they're related.
Yeah.
Sleipnir is a Norse myth about Loki. It's funny, look it up.
If you were a Marvel fan in 2012, you're very aware of it.
Yes. I don't know why I'm telling this to you. You all were on Tumblr in 2012, I'm sure. But the way Percy talks about Poseidon in this is very...
Right, like Percy having to sit here and describe these...
His dad. Like, in the same way that Zeus did, too. That's the other thing. Mm-hmm. It's like the setup as well.
And he says, I don't think I wrote down the actual line, but he's talking about, he's like, this man should be arrested. My father should be arrested for what happened here. And then he says that Demeter can't even report him to Zeus because Zeus is just as bad.
Yeah.
And then he goes on to write a very positive chapter about Poseidon later on.
Yeah. And it's a strange... He has a lot of feelings about this, you can tell, but he's just sort of... you can tell he's just like, you know what? Because here's the thing, too. Like, he didn't have to tell this story. This is, a very...
It feels a lot like Percy's, trying very hard to tell you what he knows about these stories, and not... he's not trying to be biased at all. He acknowledges that he's biased, but he is trying to let you know that, all of the gods are bad sometimes, including my dad. And I'm not going to let him off the hook because he's my dad.
To add to that as well, the source of this myth is Pausanias. It's not in Hesiod. It's not in Apollodorus. It's not in the Hymn to Demeter. This story mostly comes from Pausanias, who's a travel writer. So, Percy here has kind of gone out of his way to include this story, is what I'm saying. There's no way anyone's straight up consulting Pausanias for mythology for fun.
Yeah, he either did his research. I don't know if I believe that he did his research. I think he did some research, but he says that he got most of these stories from actual people involved or people within this world. So I assume that if it comes from a source that he probably wouldn't have consulted, it probably came from a real person in his real life.
Interesting.
Yeah. I don't know who's telling him these stories.
I don't know. But what is also interesting is Despoine, who is the child of Demeter. They have 2 children. Well, actually, I know why this was included. It's because they have 2 children, one of which is Arion, Hazel's horse.
Oh, right.
The other is Despoine. She's an Arcadian goddess that was apparently involved in a Greek mystery cult related to Demeter, and you weren't allowed to learn her name until you were initiated. Yeah, it's interesting also because there is a lot of cults to Demeter specifically that pop up. I think just... Emily putting on her conspiracy theorist anthropology hat here. It's just I'm sure there were a lot of harvest mysteries indigenous to Greece that kind of all eventually got attributed to Demeter as they developed and as the society kind of grew and changed. So why she's considered to be important at all is probably because she is very important to a local mystery cult, but also Arion, the horse.
Mm-hmm. So the Demeter chapter... then sort of bleeds into, there's a Persephone chapter here that's sort of a continuation of the Demeter chapter, where we get the Persephone Hades story that we all know and love.
Yeah, and this one I can confirm is essentially word for word the Hymn to Demeter. I know this Greek very, very well. Aside from all of the editorializations on Persephone.
Yeah. Percy has no sympathy for her at all.
He thinks she's spoiled and privileged. The way he writes about her is so this girl, she had everything.
Yeah. It was very...
what happened to her even so bad? It was so weird.
It was very, she's a Nepo baby, and I don't...
Yeah.
Which, I mean, Percy's It reminded me of the way that Percy talks about rich kids.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me because, you know, I think about your Westport, Connecticut rant too, where you're like, well, you were talking about how like the economic disparity like was probably something that appealed to Rick when he was thinking about Luke's backstory and like how that like the contrast with Percy.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, I wasn't getting a lot of Luke vibes in this chapter, but it was something I was thinking about a little bit of like this is Percy's attitude towards people that grew up a lot more privileged than him.
Mm-hmm.
It was also kind of interesting because it's like I went into this, I remember when we did the sort of Hades, but there is a lot of like cultural context of the Persephone myth. It makes this read on it very strange to me because the way I've kind of thought about it is the Hades and Persephone myth at the end of the day, it's a lot about marriage and specifically the female perspective on marriage, but like really playing on this idea of like you kind of moving on to a new phase of your life, but like also your old self kind of dying when you marry somebody. And then there's also this whole interesting thing of like, apparently part of the myth as well is that in ancient Greek society, if there were no male heirs to somebody, what they would often do was marry one of the daughters to like the uncle to like keep it in the family. And so it was sort of also a myth that was kind of like, oh yeah, that's a thing. You know, there's a lot of just like messed up stuff in terms of familial relationships that is part of this myth. And also in this version too, it really takes the like more modern interpretation of the myth in terms of Hades, where it's like Hades is this like actually like he's just kind of like a nice guy that like everyone thinks is evil because of his job. But at the same time, like this characterization of Persephone doesn't give her like the agency that interpretation of the myth has of like her wanting to be married to Hades. It's a strange take. But like in the Hymn to Demeter,
that's what I was about to ask.
The beats are all the same, but in the Hymn to Demeter, it's a lot more painted as like this poor girl. And then as far as the eating the pomegranate seeds and stuff, it's actually pomegranate or mulberry seeds. But in this version, it's like she's hungry, so she eats it. But in the like Hymn to Demeter, it's kind of implied that she's tricked into it, like nefariously by the gardener. And like Hades is like implied to be complicit in tricking her. It's not like overtly stated, but she's tricked into it by the gardener, presumably at Hades' behest. And then Hermes comes to get her. And he brings her back to Demeter. And Demeter is like, oh my god, I'm so happy to have you back. Are you okay? Like, what happened? There's like this tearful, beautiful reunion between them. Now, did you eat anything? And then Persephone sort of like, I'm so sorry. I was tricked into it. I did eat something. So like, that's the way the story is in the Hymn to Demeter. And I feel like in this version, it's more just like, she doesn't know what she's doing and she just sort of is gullible. Like, that's like the characterization instead of like, this is a young girl stolen from her youth, which very much is the undercurrent of like, the Hymn to Demeter, at least when I read it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's strange though, because I feel like in the interpretation of the myth where Hades has good intentions, Persephone has a lot more agency. Mm-hmm. So, but in this version, she doesn't. She's just like this girl that gets taken and is just like doesn't know any better.
Yeah, it was this depiction of Hades as like, oh well, he didn't really know any better either, and I was like, I don't.
It like takes the tragedy away from the story, this depiction of Persephone.
Mm. Is the moment where he gives her the garden as like a gift from
I don't think that's in it.
It feels very taken from Beauty and the Beast.
Yeah.
Because that's the moment right before she eats the pomegranate, so it felt like it was almost like a, oh, but she's starting to like it here, so she decides to eat something, but not like it's not like an intentional, I'm going to stay here, I'm going to eat something. It's like, I just love pomegranates so much.
Yeah. Like the story is of like her Persephone's name in mythology for a long time was Corde, which just means maiden. Like it's young girl, basically. Like she's like her role in mythology, in this story and in this mythology as like an archetypical like young girl who is just like the picture of like innocence and all this stuff. And so like her treatment in this myth is sort of in that way also, I think, archetypical of like how this society views and treats young girls. So
right.
There's a lot in there.
And then in comes Percy Jackson being like, I don't care.
She's privileged. She's a Nepo baby. And, like, he's not wrong, but, like, I think the purpose of the myth, it's telling a very different story.
Uh-huh. Yeah. So we move from Persephone on to Hera.
I really didn't make that many notes on Hera.
I also didn't make many notes on Hera. Sorry to Hera, but...
Hera's interesting because, like, I think he's trying to, like, make her a bit more sympathetic, but not really. And she just, like, the villain in so many of these stories, you know?
Yeah, but he did manage to find the ones where it's not Hera's fault for her chapter.
Yeah, well, aside from the Hephaestus story, which...
Right. The only notes I made on Hera were, we get into the tree with the golden apples. I actually didn't make this note on the chapter itself. I made it because in the illustrated version, that's like the big illustration on the cover pages. Like when you first open the book, that's what you see is that tree, which, considering the Luke of it all,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It was just sort of like an interesting way to start off the story. Is the first thing that you really see when you open the book is that tree. The other note I made was a silly one, because it was when Hera's talking to Semele, and she's like, oh, I'm your old nursemaid, Beryl, which is Beryl Grace. Like, it was just a funny, like, Hera accident, like, slipping up and saying a name that will be very important several thousand years from now. Just a funny little moment. Really, the Hera chapters, I made no notes on.
So then we move on to Hades. Again, he comes off smelling like roses in this. He's sort of presented as, like, this the underworld, like, existed before him as a place where people went to die, but it was just sort of this wild west of, like, anyone could do anything, and there wasn't, like, a control or, like, a system, and it just, like, didn't make any sense. And you can tell he, like, was pulling a little bit from the Hesiod ages of, like, gold and silver and stuff, describing the chaos of what death looked like in all of these different societies, which I think only makes sense if you're taking my interpretation of the ages, which are, like, they correspond to different historical periods of different cultures being for the predominant ruling ones of Greece, which means they all had, like, different mythologies about, like, what happened when you died. I did find it interesting that we talked about a little about the rivers of the underworld and the layout.
Oh, yeah. The moment where he started talking about the Lethe was interesting to me. Because he spent several pages talking about each river in detail and what it does to you. And, like, knowing that we were just coming off of House of Hades when this book came out, I was like, oh, he's speaking from experience.
Yeah.
But he does say when he gets to the Lethe, he says that it is his personal least favorite. It was kind of surprising to me, but it made sense. He says, oh, it's my personal least favorite because I've had some bad experiences with amnesia, long story. Knowing that he had just experienced all of these things, and that the Lethe was still his least favorite. Something about Percy hating the feeling of losing himself and losing the people that he cares about more than any of the pain that these other rivers cause you.
Yeah.
Oh, I also want to note that at one point in this Hades chapter, Percy says that the Yankees are better than the Red Sox, and I just feel like all of my personal headcanons are taking hits. Percy is a Mets fan. We all know this. A Mets fan would never admit that the Yankees are better than anyone. And I'm attributing this to Rick is not from New York and he doesn't know these things.
He's a Bostonian.
Right. It's out of character. Yeah, and Percy talks about, like, the invention of opium also in this chapter, which was strange.
Yeah. A lot of just like little strange things where I'm like,
I never thought I'd hear you talking about this.
Yeah.
Anyway.
I made only one note on the entire Poseidon chapter. Again, it's a weird thing how Percy loves Poseidon and is like, yeah, he's definitely the best, when the only story we have of Poseidon up until this point is the Demeter one.
Yeah. It's like he chose in this chapter all of the versions of each of these stories where Poseidon looks better than he would if he'd gone with any other version of the story.
The Athens one, the naming of Athens is an interesting one, because, like, it's told differently than what I thought, I'm used to, which is the Apollodorus version, where There's apparently like a salt spring near Athens, so the idea was like Poseidon tried to give them a gift of a salt spring, and everyone was like, okay, we can't drink this though. And then Athena gives them an olive tree. And I was trying to find the version where Poseidon gives them horses. It's on theoi.com without a source. So I don't know where that comes from. Yeah, I don't know why Percy picked this one.
I think he picked it because it makes Poseidon sound smarter.
That's true. It does make him sound better.
If you tell the version where he made a salt spring and everyone was like, why would we want this? It doesn't sound nearly as good as my dad invented horses and they just weren't suited to the terrain where these people lived, so they went for the olive tree. But it was like this story plus the Andromeda story where it's like, oh yeah, Poseidon allowed Perseus to save her. Just, he kept telling versions of the stories where I was like, uh-huh. Yeah. And the Medusa one, everything seems consensual.
Like, if anything, Athena kind of comes off that story not sounding so good. But then, like, in the next chapter with Athena, it was very similar. It was similar vibes where he was saying nice things about Athena.
Yeah.
I feel like he's got some stuff he just hasn't unpacked here. Like, I just feel like there's a lot of cognitive dissonance in this book sometimes.
There definitely
It's like when
is.
he's consciously writing about a specific god, he's writing about, like, the version of him that he wants to write about. But then when, like, they crop up in other places, it's sort of like he can't help but...
It slips through sometimes.
Yeah.
Okay, let's think about this. If we're looking at this book as post Heroes of Olympus, we know that Percy is in a place where he is not happy with the gods. But it would make sense if that thought hasn't totally extended to his dad yet.
But, like, it's not just Poseidon. He is, in my opinion, way too nice to Athena.
I thought that he was actually... Let's talk about Athena. Let's talk about Athena, because...
Yeah. The one I wrote down that floored me was, like, Athena loves giving people second chances. When you just told the Medusa story.
The one that stuck with me was telling the palace story.
Yeah.
Because I rarely hear that story, and it's the first one of these that I feel like is actually presented as, like, a tragedy.
Yeah.
As, like, you should feel really sorry for this god. And I think that was... I don't remember if that was the first Athena story told, but it was early on in the Athena chapter. The palace story is also interesting because I was kind of taking a mental note of, like, when certain illustrations popped up. Because I don't know what the process was of, like, creating illustrations for this book, but I assume at least part of it was, like, these are the moments we want to hit hard, and there is a drawing or painting of the palace and Athena moment. It's like he wants that to hit you. He really wants that part to, like, to stick with you. And then we get the statue is of Pallas instead of Athena.
It is interesting, that, like, story of, like, the duality of a person. It's, like, being represented by them kind of merging identities with somebody that was a huge influence on them when they were young. And, like, whose tragic demise when they were young was a huge influence on them. And how they, like, kind of take on that identity. Like, I feel like there's a lot of stuff in Greek myth where that happens. Or, like, the deeds that turn you into who you are kind of becoming part of your very name. Like, I'm thinking, like, Phoebus Apollo as well, like, slaying Python. And, again, like you said, it's a story you don't hear very often about Athena. So it's interesting that this one's brought in, of, like, this is who she is. She's somebody who trained, who worked for what she has. Again, it's this characterization of her in this way. Not as, like, somebody born into power immediately, but, like, who is a little more relatable. Unlike Persephone.
Right. Who we all hate, of course.
Yeah, it's also interesting to me, the Arachne story, and the way it's told here. Because, I mean, this is the Ovid version. Specifically where Arachne hangs herself in shame, and then Athena turns into a spider, instead of, like, just her turning into a spider. Like, out of spite and fear. Because, like, I feel like when I think of this story and when I've heard versions of the story, usually it's just a story of a mortal going up against a god, the god being jealous that the mortal is as good as them, and then them kind of striking them down. There's another story that I think actually parallels this much later in the Apollo chapter,
Yeah.
And it is kind of interesting, the contrast between those two.
Mm-hmm.
But this version is the most merciful version of Athena. This version is the most patient. This version is the least prideful. It's interesting to me also that, like, the thing about Athena and her pride that, like, I feel is a strong part of Annabeth's character is not, like, emphasized in this book. Like, we only really get close to it with, like, the Tiresias story, which also is a different version of the Tiresias story than the one I usually tell, which doesn't involve Athena at all.
Yeah.
It's, like, punishment but mercy.
I feel like we should explain what this version of the Arachne myth is, though, that we end up going with.
Yeah, so in this version of the Arachne myth, content warning, by the way, for suicide, but so basically the crowd turns against Arachne, kind of at Athena's behalf, and she's so, like, embarrassed and so impacted by, like, the resolution of the contest that she hangs herself in shame. And then Athena saves her by turning her into a spider.
It is essential to note that Athena, like, beats Arachne to the point where she just... You know, this version is, like, instead of Athena winning, it's a tie. She looks at both of them and is like, these are equally good. And Arachne reacts to that with, like, oh, so do we do, like, a rematch or something? And Athena's like, no, I think I just beat you to death.
And then the crowd turns against Arachne for some reason.
Well, I mean, Athena is mid-punishment. You don't want to go up against Athena. But with the crowd all booing and taking Athena's side, Athena starts to feel bad for her and stops and says, enough. Would you turn on your own people so quickly? At least Arachne had some talent. What makes you people so special? And Percy says that the moral of the story isn't don't compare yourself to the gods because you can't be that good. It's know when to brag and when to keep your mouth shut. Or sometimes life isn't fair, even if you are as gifted as Athena. Or maybe don't give away free tapestries.
Which I don't think is the moral of the story he told.
I feel like the moral of the story that he's telling is coming more from, like, what Athena's doing than from what Arachne's doing. I feel like it's hard to moralize from the human perspective because the humans are always just sort of, like, not expecting the gods to just walk into their life and start doing these things to them. But I feel like you can look at Athena's story and say it's about something about dishing out punishments, something about being prideful.
I think that's the thing. I think a lot of Athena myths, her characterization to me is so baked in pride in the mythology and the touchstones like I have. And I feel like it comes through in Percy Jackson because of, like, Annabeth's fatal flaw. But I feel like this characterization of Athena, she's not prideful. That's why I feel like she comes off. It's like Athena without her fatal flaw.
Mm.
If the gods can have fatal flaws.
Right. It's like she's prideful enough that she showed up to challenge Arachne and beat her with a stick for tying with her.
Very Roman of her, honestly.
But not prideful enough to go through with a lot of the things that she actually does.
Honestly, I'm thinking about it too. There might be some interesting historical context here, because Ovid was writing the Metamorphosis around the time of the first reign of Augustus. So it is coming from a different perspective on, like, humans trying to be on the level of the gods on account of the fact that Augustus was, like, actively trying to promote himself as a godlike figure. And so I feel like this particular lens of the Roman people and people making art in the reign of somebody who, like, you know, at this point, like, the elites are the ones commissioning these things. Augustus, I think, had a role in commissioning Ovid's work, the Metamorphosis that has this story. Like, this is coming from a different perspective from the Greeks, just in terms of, like, justifying the fact that a mortal can ascend to that level of God sometimes, provided they are exceptional, and, like, the gods will still be merciful towards them. So it's interesting to me that, again, this is sort of the version we're going with. Yeah.
And that there's so much sympathy for Arachne, considering in the last book that we would have read when this came out, Percy...
That is... Oh, yeah! Wait, in the Arachne... Yeah, I forgot she tells her story in the end of House of Hades. What does she say her story
Athena.
is?
I don't remember. It probably doesn't paint Athena in a very good light. But Percy did kill her again in Tartarus and then say that she died too easy. But in
not
this,
a lot of love. Maybe he's just an Arachne anti.
In this, I feel like he's also painting Arachne in a good light, because he talks about how, like, she was coming from a very humble background and it made her feel like, no, I'm not going to attribute any of this to the gods because I did all of it myself. And so when Athena shows up saying, like, but Athena invented weaving, and she's like, so? And so it feels like also there's a lot of sympathy for Arachne, both from Percy and from Athena in his version.
Yeah.
Let's move on to Aphrodite. Percy describes her as born in the wake of the first murder, which was a cool...
I love that. Love that about her. My first note on this chapter is who taught Rick about OTPs.
My concern was who taught Percy about OTPs.
What do we think Percy's OTP is?
I was like, where are you hearing this? Like, what fandom are you in? Especially because he can't really, like, he can't use technology. I'm like, where are you reading? Like,
oh my god.
Like, what, the physical fan fiction magazines from we know he doesn't like Star Trek, so it wasn't the Star Trek stuff. Like,
there's also a reference to Tumblr later in this book. Percy's on Tumblr,
and he's talking about OTPs with someone.
He's just like us. Anyway.
My first note on this chapter is about the Pandora story.
I feel like, to me, this story, it's like we're trying to be feminist, but we're not being feminist. It's like, I'm not gonna, like, he says a whole lot about how he's not gonna blame the lady. I'm not gonna blame Pandora, because blaming women is bad. The ancient Greeks love to blame women, and it's like, that is correct. And then he proceeds to be like, so anyway, it's all Aphrodite's fault. And it's just like, okay, so close. So close.
It's so close, but also the gods don't count, so you can just...
Yeah.
When he was comparing it to, like, Adam and Eve and was saying, like, the blame game, it's been going on for forever just so that we can blame women. Am I right? Am I right, ladies? Yeah, he, after explaining all of this, says, my real question is, what was Aphrodite thinking? If she knew this whole Pandora thing would give women a bad rep for eternity, why did she go along with it? Me, I think she just didn't care about the consequences. She wanted to make Pandora beautiful. She wanted to prove that love could succeed where the other gods had failed, even if it caused a global disaster. Way to go, Aphrodite. Thanks a lot.
Like, it's blaming her for women being blamed. Ignoring, like, the rest of that story where they're like, we need to humble humanity.
Right, ignoring the fact that Zeus, like, packed the jar with all of this stuff.
No, the problem is that Aphrodite made her pretty.
Yeah. Maybe women should just try not being beautiful.
Maybe women should only be beautiful if they don't know they're beautiful.
Right.
Which makes them more beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Maybe women should just stop being so curious.
Maybe women should stop having thoughts or opinions or agency.
Right.
We did it. We solved feminism.
But yeah, it is like Zeus was also right there and did half the work to Percy.
You know, we all, you know, we have our journeys. He's on the right path. He's just not quite there yet. He needs to take a couple women's studies courses in college.
Right. I mean, Annabeth also tends to blame women sometimes.
This is true. Then we get the Adonis story. Mm-hmm. It's a weird one. Where he's, like, really trying to make, like, Aphrodite and Persephone
sound like it's totally normal.
a kid. And then wanting to date that both of them, fighting over wanting to be with the child they raised. That's not a part of the myth people, you know.
I didn't know this one.
I didn't know that part either. I'd never heard of that. This is me just, like, doing some very haphazard research, but it seems to come from a work by Clement of Alexandria. He's living in the 2nd century AD. And this dude is trying to convert the Greek pagans to Christianity. So he wrote a whole book about the immorality, essentially, of the Greek mythos, which I think is what this one comes from. I'm sure, I don't think he made it up. Like, I'm sure there is a version of the story that involves this, and he probably heard it and was like, oh my god. But, why is Percy reading this is my question. Like, where did he come across this? Who told him this?
Yeah, I think stuff like this is stuff that he's being told.
By who? Who knows as many deep cuts on Adonis? Who's super Christian? Because it's, like, not a good story. It's just, like, grooming.
I don't know.
I don't know.
Let's move on to Ares.
Let's not, yeah, we don't need to dwell on this whole mess. I feel like I was expecting him to be way more Ares anti than he is. Like, he doesn't like him in this book, clearly, but, like, the way he characterizes him to me is more like, he's a bully and I don't like him, instead of, like, fuck this guy. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like, I was thinking, like, I feel like this characterization doesn't line up with the Percy that's, like, watched his treatment of Clarice. And, like, I feel like it also doesn't line up with the way he, like, talks to Mars in Son of Neptune. Like, he's a lot more antagonistic, you know? And what was also kind of interesting was, like, he tells a story of a time Ares, like, protected his daughter. And this is the only time in the book, I think, that they actually use the word rape.
It is. Because I was listening to the audiobook and it made me jump.
Yeah, same. And so it was interesting to me that, like, it's this story that's, like, the only time we're acknowledging that. And, like, that it's, like, it's a story that is painting Ares in, like, a good light. Where it's, like, let's tell the story of how Ares killed somebody for threatening his daughter. And, like, he was put on trial for it and acquitted.
While Poseidon is the one on the opposite side.
Yeah.
I feel like as I read through the book, I could feel Percy getting to the point where he was just, like, sick of having to explain the same situations over and over and over.
Yeah. And there is an interesting line in this part, like, Percy makes, like, when talking about the fact that Ares was acquitted of it, he sort of makes this comment of, like, because, of course, it's only okay when immortals do that. Yeah,
he says, in the end, the gods decided Ares was innocent. Sure, he'd gone a little overboard mangling Hal's body like that, but the guy had been assaulting Ares' daughter. That wasn't cool. Only gods could get away with stuff like that.
It's interesting that a story about Ares, like a very, very D-tier story about Ares and his daughter, and the daughter of Ares, which I think are pretty rare in mythology. Like, I'm trying to think of any other daughters of Ares in myth that I know of, and I don't think so, because mostly you talk about his sons. It is interesting to me that, like, that story grabbed Percy of, like, Ares and his daughter, and, like, how it is interesting how it is all related to justice. Because it seems like it's a myth that is there to explain a piece of the Athenian justice system.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. It's also another one of those times where Percy is introduced to a son of Poseidon who he doesn't want to claim as brother.
Yeah.
Is what he says. And so I feel like that might be part of why it feels like it tips him over the edge a little bit. The fact that he starts using, like, very straightforward language all of a sudden, it feels like it makes him go to a point where he's like,
Yeah.
But yeah, it seems like for most of the gods, he tries to find at least one where they were all right.
Yeah.
Where they weren't fully in the wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Except for maybe Zeus. I don't remember there being a good one for Zeus.
I feel like the origins of him taking over from
Kronos,
right?
That's true.
Like that.
I was thinking of Zeus.
It's interesting, though. I was thinking about, like, picturing him on Olympus as cupbearer, and I kept thinking about, like, Chalice of the Gods in the end, where we get, like, the dining scene. So we have, like, a much more vivid picture of, like, what that looks like now. But, like, where Zeus is the tyrannical overlord of it. So, it's just interesting. Anyway, that being said, Percy then still wants to humble Ares. So he's like, I'm going to tell a silly story now. But again, it's like, I'm going to humble him by telling a story where he doesn't look great, not like, I'm going to tell a story where he did horrible things. So, but I do think, like, sort of Percy's opinion on Ares is like, this guy isn't worth taking down. I beat him already. I already beat him up.
Yeah. This is definitely one of those books where, like, the Blame Zeus comes through, where you can feel him. Like, because he's in, like, every story. He's at least in the background of every story as, like, the real cause behind a lot of these things. And so the one it feels like is really his target in this book, it's not Ares at this point.
Yeah. I would say the next two sections with Hephaestus and Apollo, in those ones, I think we also shift where Hera is really the villain. Like, the main story we get from Hephaestus is, you know, him kind of returning to Olympus after he'd been thrown away, and he makes them all thrones and all these gifts, but he traps Hera in her throne, and he keeps repeating over and over and over again, you threw me away to her. Like, he essentially, like, creates a major disruption on Olympus in reaction to that. Which again is this theme of, like, being overlooked by your parents that we see kind of, like, echoing from the Zeus takeover parts. And then like when you get the origin of like Apollo and Artemis and Leto and her relationship with Hera, also you really get her as this vengeful goddess going out of her way to punish people, even though she's like mad at Zeus. So again, undercurrent of Blame Zeus, but like you do get a lot of vengeful Hera in these latter parts of this book. Like we definitely end on a vengeful Hera note, I would say, which makes sense if this is post Heroes of Olympus. So there's a lot of very detailed description of Hera hounding Leto.
I will say Apollo doesn't come off looking all that good either, though.
Really? I mean, at least in the introduction of the story, he's like, Apollo, he's so cool. And to the point where I'm like, is Apollo holding Percy hostage right now? Is sort of my thought.
That was how I felt, but then, like, once you got into the stories, we got, like, I don't know, you include the flaying the satyr one.
Yeah, so this is the one we sort of mentioned that parallels, I feel like, the Arachne story, where it's the guy playing musical instrument, and Apollo sets up this contest. But, like, Apollo is much worse to this guy than Athena is to Arachne.
Yeah, like, there's very little sympathy given here in the way that there is in the Athena.
Yeah, like, a point is made that Athena, like, swears on the River Styx to judge fairly, and Apollo makes no such bargain, and honestly uses the crowd's fear of retribution from him to rig the game, basically. Yeah, and then skins him. So again, very, like, we're going from, like, the PG-13 version of this to, like, nah, we're just...
Yeah.
We also end on the Daphne story. Mm-hmm. We do get the hymn to Apollo, by the way. The hymn to the Apollo is the story of him slaying Python. We also get a lot of references to, like, the story of the woman with the 14 children that she brags about and stuff. That's all in the hymn to Apollo. Yeah, the Apollo and Daphne story, though, I think is presented as, like, that final look at Apollo, where Percy, I think, frames it like, well, let me tell you a story, though, of, like, the one time Apollo fell in love.
Yeah.
Because he sort of paints him and Artemis as these two, like, eternal... essentially youthful figures in the pantheon, where it's like everyone else is getting married, everyone else has roles they fill that are like part and parcel to their relationships. Like it feels like almost like they do things organically and then kind of get frozen. And like the way Apollo gets frozen is like you're the eternal bachelor. Mm-hmm. Then the other interesting thing is in this one, usually in the story, Daphne, when she wants to get turned into a tree, prays to her father, who's a river god. I don't think I've ever heard a version that was different from that. Except for Percy Jackson's, when she prays to Gaia. Yeah. to turn her, to save her.
I had heard this before, but I don't know from where.
Oh. Percy Jackson?
I haven't read this book before, so it wasn't this. Unless it's come up. Maybe it came up in Trials of Apollo. Maybe that's the version that was in Trials of Apollo. Let me look up, I'm going to look in the Hidden Oracle and just search the word Gaia and see if that comes up.
That might be a bit more stuff to sort through.
I don't think it'll be that much. I think it'll be very little. Yeah. The stories say I chased her on a whim, that she was just another pretty dress. The stories are wrong. When she begged Gaia to turn her into a laurel tree, and in order to escape me, part of my heart hardened into bark as well. I don't know if it comes up ever again, but that's where I heard it from.
But anyway, what I thought was interesting about this was that when Percy said that he was going to talk about the only person that Apollo had ever loved, I thought he was going to start talking about Hyacinthus, like to give us a reason to like him after the skinning a satyr story, but instead he went with a much more controversial story. So even the one that's supposed to make you feel for him, it felt like it still wasn't giving him as much grace as I think some of the other gods got. Like even when given the opportunity to paint him in a positive light, like with this, or with like the Python story, I thought we were going to spend some time with that, but instead it's like maybe half a page. We move through it all very quickly or don't touch on it at all. So I started to feel like maybe this was a chapter characterizing Apollo in preparation for Trials of Apollo. Because the attitude that the chapter is written with is pretty positive, but the actual stories that are being told are not. Yeah. And Percy has this one line where he says, the main thing to know about Apollo, never underestimate the guy. One day he might be the god of limericks and stupid earworm songs and first aid classes. The next day he's the god of chemical weapons and world-destroying plagues. And you thought Poseidon had a split personality. Apollo wouldn't kill you for no reason. He just didn't need much of a reason. So. But then at the end of the chapter, he says, Eros had the last laugh, but generally speaking, Apollo was right to brag. He was the best archer in the world.
Again, it's like, is
Percy
Jackson, blink twice, Percy Jackson.
But he says that the one person who is as good or maybe better than Apollo at archery is Artemis. Then we move into Artemis stories.
Artemis is an interesting one. The Actaeon story of him, like, watching her and all of them bathe and then, like, falling in love with her is way creepier if you're picturing Artemis and all of the maidens as, like, 13-year-olds. Yeah. I never thought about that before.
I hadn't thought about that until you said it.
So it was interesting, though, because I feel like thinking about that made me reframe. And also, like, again, thinking about Artemis and Apollo as, like, the young... Like, if all these gods are sort of, like, manifestations of aspects of, like, an ancient Greek life, like, the sort of... I know, like, Hebe's the goddess of youth, but, like, Artemis and Apollo kind of being these, like, beacons of, like, carefree youth, of, like, before you settle down and marry and have your own children. It kind of gives them an interesting place in the pantheon. I also enjoyed, like... It felt to me like they had a bond in Percy's telling of these stories that I don't often feel reading mythology.
Yeah, I don't think any of these stories involve Apollo even, the Artemis stories. But, like, you can feel him because he references him a couple of times with, like, it's like, oh, maybe the boar was sent by Apollo because he didn't like this guy being near his sister, and, like...
I think Artemis is also painted as, like, the story of, God, what's her name? Caledonia? No.
Oh, Callisto?
Callisto.
Yeah.
I think that's the story that paints Artemis in the best light, where she's got this friendship and she's like, how, like, I'm so mad that this happened. Like, I would have helped you. Like, I don't know. Like, again, she still, like, does what she does, but there's regret there. Maybe that's, like, where we kind of end all of the stories on ones where the gods, like, do something they regret, and it, like, does sort of paint them differently and give them a little bit more edge and tragedy to their characterizations. I don't know if we always end on one, but, like, most of these stories do include at least one of those kinds.
Yeah, I feel like Artemis's stories are unique because so much of them have to do with, like, her relationships with mortals in, like, a positive light. Talking about, oh, Artemis's two best friends, her other best friend, and they're all just, like, mortal people who she spent her time with.
It makes for an interesting setup to Dionysus, too. Oh, we didn't even talk about Hermes.
Hermes is next.
I didn't take any notes on Hermes.
I didn't take any notes on Hermes. I expected to take notes on Hermes because I was like, oh, Luke, my friend Luke. And then it was just sort of the stories that I knew in the way that I know them.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it's like the hymn to Hermes, basically, I think. Again, I enjoyed, like, I think because Kronos and Zeus are characterized as trickster gods, it's, like, kind of interesting to see Hermes, who is the actual trickster god, kind of come last and, like, bookend that a little bit.
Yeah.
Well, almost. Second to last.
And I guess we could read into the fact that Percy gives hardly any opinions on Hermes. That, like, he gets to Hermes and just tells things so straight that it feels pointed, maybe? Maybe thinking about Hermes comes with too many questions that he doesn't feel prepared to think about yet.
Yeah. But then we transition, last but not least, to Dionysus. This one was so interesting to me, just because, like, this is the full story of somebody not born a god necessarily, up, like, fully apotheosizing into a god. Which, considering, this is the part where I'm like, oh, if we just came off House of Hades, this is very interesting to me. Because if you recall my House of Hades theories, it was the apotheosis of Percy Jackson.
Yes.
It's funny because, like, Percy sort of starts the chapter being like, I don't like this guy. But then the story he tells, it doesn't feel that way. It feels like he actually identifies with him a lot more than he's letting on. There was a lot of parallels I was seeing. Like, we begin Dionysus' story with grief. Grieving his mom. And then grieving his friend who just dies in a horrible accident. And then turning that grief into, like, the power to force something good to come of it in the form of, like, the grapes. Like, it feels like this Dionysus, he eventually wants power and comes into it. But it feels like at the beginning of his story, he doesn't. Like, it's just him trying to make the best of his grief, and it's powerful enough that it fundamentally changes things.
Yeah, I was thinking a lot about when we see Dionysus at the end of Battle of the Labyrinth, right? When one of those two dies, and I can't remember which one it is.
I was thinking about, like, Titan's Curse Dionysus, where we see the edges of the violence and madness that have shaped his story.
Yeah.
But I feel like this version doesn't touch on them that much. Like, all of the whole story, although, to be fair, the myth of him, like, going out to India and stuff, it's not an ancient Greek myth. It's like a Byzantine thing. Like, they just kind of made it up. It's written in Greek, but it was written down, like, a good 1,000, 2,000 years after, like, most of the rest of these. And it's definitely, like, based on Alexander the Great's campaign in India. And, like, the story of the dolphins and everything. Like, there's definitely versions of that are a lot more horrifying. And the story of, like, Ariadne. Like, there's a lot of different versions of that. And in some of them, Dionysus goes and tells Theseus to leave her behind. I think Dionysus tells Percy in Titan's Curse, where he's like, no, that hero just left her. And, like, I saw her, and I talked to her, and we connected, and I fell in love. Which is so human. Like, even the Maenad stories, like, there's some horrible Maenad stories, and we don't get those.
Yeah, instead we get, like, Dionysus and his followers, like, all of them being attacked and most of them dying, and Dionysus walking out and then trying to figure out how to regroup and come back.
He's so much more interesting and human in this than the rest of the gods, I think.
Yeah, because he is.
It's really like taking that speech he gives to Percy to heart.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, watching him claim his godliness. I felt like I was reading, like, a mini... I really liked this chapter.
Yeah, it's a good chapter.
But yeah, watching him, like, realize the power that he was gaining and start to embrace it and, like, figuring out how to lead these people and all of that.
It's interesting. And again, it makes me think of, like, this is a Percy who's come close to godliness several times. So seeing his perspective on somebody who did go the distance in this way is really interesting. And the depth to which we learn about Dionysus's character, it clues me into the fact that I think Percy is feeling a lot more empathy for him at this stage.
It could also be, now that I'm thinking about it, this is a Percy who the last time that he saw, not Dionysus, but Bacchus, who's essentially the same person as Percy. Bacchus was the one who made him have that, like, oh, I understand exactly why Luke felt the way that he did in Mark of Athena. So it could also be that this is a Percy who has reached that point with the gods, who's now looking at a hero who did make that journey to godhood, and then several thousand years later ends up representing what's wrong with the gods to Percy, and trying to imagine how a person gets there. Like, he's giving him that level of complexity because he's trying to understand him. And what makes a hero like me turn into one of the gods that I've been describing for this whole book. And also reconciling all of that with the Mr. D that he now knows. So maybe him giving him his sort of happy ending at the end, it's also coming from him having told the story and beginning to understand Mr. D more fully.
And I feel like him bringing Ariadne as his queen, to me, adds something interesting of, like, him keeping a tether to the mortal world and him keeping a tether to, like, more normalcy. Plus still being a god.
Right. And then we wrap it up, we get our afterword. I did enjoy Percy saying, I know some of you are going to be complaining, like, you forgot to talk about Cheese Whiz, the god of mice. I was like, that's a great made-up god, actually.
I think it's a good primer on the gods.
Uh-huh.
Some absolutely bizarre deep cuts, for sure. But I feel like all speak to, like, a little bit of the cognitive dissonance still going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. To me, I feel like this book is, besides being a good guide to the gods, it's probably most valuable to me as a window, like I said, into Percy's attitude toward the gods and mental state post Heroes of Olympus. I think it reflects a lot on each god individually, but also I feel like we can see Percy trying to, like you said, the cognitive dissonance of it all. Like, you can feel Percy trying to understand his own feelings on the gods and where he stands with them right now after his experiences in that series, which will all eventually lead to him turning them down and refusing the call to action in Trials of Apollo. Also, I do want to point out,
Percy says, we've covered most of the major players. You probably know enough now to avoid getting zapped into a pile of ash if you ever come across any of the 12 Olympians. Probably. Me, I'm late to meet my girlfriend. Annabeth is going to kill me. And it was just something about, like, if I displease my girlfriend, she's going to zap me into a pile of ash.
Annabeth is more Athena than Athena in this book.
Yeah, there's just something about putting those two sentences back to back. Anyway, any beads? A bead for...
Oh, for the book? Oh, no. I have two. One's kind of grim, though, so I should probably go with the other one. But my first thought is Arachne's noose. But I think instead I'm going to go with the cup, Zeus being the cupbearer to Kronos.
Yeah, that's a good one.
How about you?
My first instinct was to put the illustration that's on the afterword on my bead, because it's Percy giving a little peace sign. And I just think it's cute.
That's good.
It's
That's
him
pretty
walking
good.
out with a little peace sign, which is symbolic because this was the last time we were in Percy's head for a long time.
Thank you all for listening to Monster Donut. Next time, Percy Jackson's heroes. Can't wait to hear what he thinks about Hercules.
We're drawing even closer to the end. If you would like to send in a question or a thought, some analysis about any Greek or Roman book, we're going to be doing a wrap-up after, I think, 2 episodes from now. So get your thoughts and questions in. We're covering everything that we've talked about to this point. You can talk about season 1 of the show, you can talk about the musical, you can talk about literally anything that we've talked about.
Please send us your thoughts and analysis. We love hearing from you and getting to read them. If you would like to do so, you can email us at monsterdonutpodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on social media on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and Blue Sky at PJOPod. Also, if you want to leave a comment on this episode wherever you're listening to it, or a rating or review, we'll also take those into account. But also, if you just want to do so because you're enjoying the podcast, that really helps us out. So we really appreciate it if you do. If you're interested in any of our merch, you can also check us out at monsterdonut.redbubble.com. I highly recommend a litany of Phoebe's art. My favorite at the moment being the himbo juice, which I recommend purchasing in muscle tank form, as our friend Darian from Music of Mythology has been rocking.
Right. That's how it's meant to be worn.
Also, if you are interested at all in supporting the podcast monetarily, we really appreciate it. And you can do so either on Patreon or through Ko-fi. And the links for both of those are in our link tree.
Speaking of which, thank you to our patrons. Latino Kaya, Patty VCK, Bethany from Public Works, Sydney Fox, Joke, Reina Avila Ramirez Arellano, Ethan Not Nakamura, Kels, Mason Bowman, Casey Cassidy, Busy Cat, Natalia, Sally Mae, Melissa Rounds, Brittad, Bones of a Carrot, Alana, Pamela Ion, The Kid on Her Own, Grace Hunker, Kaylee, Manu Munshin, Calamity, Eddie Burns, Sarah Brown, Colby Redfern, Iz, and May.
Thank you all so much. We really appreciate it. Bye, everyone.
Goodbye!
If you're like most of us, you start shopping for a dress at T-minus the thing you need the dress for. And if that's a fail, stand back, sis. It's not pretty. Gratefully, there's Evereve. If you know, you know. And if you don't, you're welcome. Evereve is the women's fashion retailer that understands your lifestyle and has the best brands and the latest trends you need to look great. Which is why your favorite new dress is here. New customers save 10% right now at evereve.com/podcast.
At Amica Insurance, we know it's more than just a house. It's your home, the place that's filled with memories. The early days of figuring it out, to the later years of still figuring it out. For the place you've put down roots, trust Amica Home Insurance. Amica, empathy is our best policy.
The world is facing urgent, monumental issues, and you may be the decision maker who can ascend to that next level in your career and make a global impact. In the heart of Washington, D.C., gain world-renowned expert knowledge and a global network as you pursue a master's degree and turn your passion into practice. Thousands of the world's leaders discovered what they're truly capable of at the George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. Are you next?